Picture a night so black the ocean looks like a sheet of oil. No moon, no horizon, only the sound of 3 engines breathing hard under a thin deck of wood. A small boat runs just off the beach, low and fast, hiding its white wake in the surf. Up ahead, a larger shadow cuts the water, a destroyer on supply duty, its searchlight sweeping like a sword. The men on the small boat crouch behind a short wooden shield, hands on triggers, eyes watering from fuel fumes. The skipper counts down without raising his voice. 30 seconds. 10. 5. He steadies his aim, fires, and throws the wheel hard. The boat kicks sideways, engines screaming, tracers snapping over the waves like angry bees. And then, far astern, a blossom of fire lifts into the night. How did a handful of wooden speedboats make steel warships turn, slow, and fear the dark? How did something so small matter so much in a war of giants? That is the riddle of America's patrol torpedo boats, the Mosquito Fleet. And tonight we begin where they were born. Start with the name, Patrol Torpedo. Not cruiser, not destroyer. Patrol Torpedo. A PT boat was a fast, wooden knife built to cut in close, strike once, and vanish. Most combat boats came in 2 main sizes. The Elko boats were around 80 feet long. The Higgins boats were a little shorter at 78 feet. Both were built from layers of mahogany over a solid frame, strong for their weight, but still wood. Under the deck sat 3 supercharged Packard V12 engines, fed with high-octane gasoline, each engine a hot, hungry animal. When all 3 were open, the boat could sprint at 40 knots or more in good water. Spray exploded off the bow. The stern threw a rooster tail taller than a man. A normal crew was a dozen or so, a skipper barely older than the boat, a seasoned coxswain on the wheel, a torpedo man, a motormac who could listen to an engine and tell you its health by the tone, gunners on twin 50 caliber machine guns, and a radio man trying to keep the set alive in the wet. At the start of the war, each boat carried 4 21-inch torpedoes in heavy tubes along the sides. They were real ship killers on paper, but the early torpedoes could be temperamental in the field. Some ran too deep. Some failed to explode. Crews learned to live with that heartbreak. You could do everything right and still see only a white streak slide under the target like a ghost. Even so, the idea of the PT boat made sense. Big warships ruled the open sea. Air power ruled the daylight. But along coasts, inside reefs, through narrow straits, at midnight in a rain squall, speed, surprise, and a single hard punch could matter more than armor. The boats did not appear by accident. Before the war, the Navy set up a brutal competition the sailors later nicknamed the Plywood Derby. Shipyards brought their best prototypes to thrash around in rough water off the East Coast. Designs pounded apart, soaked their wires in salt, shook bolts loose, and taught their builders hard lessons. Elko, working out of Bayonne, pushed toward an 80-foot hull that could carry weight and keep speed in chop. Higgins in New Orleans used their shallow draft boat-building know-how to craft a tough hull that liked bad water. Another firm, Huckins, brought clever ideas that pressured the others to improve. The prize was not pride, it was production. When the war opened, both Elko and Higgins won big orders, and small towns near their factories were swallowed by the noise of saws, the smell of glue, and the rhythm of 3 shifts a day. Boats are nothing without people. To train a new kind of sailor, the Navy built a school at Melville, Rhode Island, called the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's Training Center. There, young officers learned to handle a craft that accelerated like a race car and stopped like a skidding sled. They studied gunnery, navigation by night, damage control with gasoline on the deck, and how to fight while soaked and deaf and dead tired. Culture formed quickly. PT crews were informal, inventive, and stubborn. They scrounged. If an Army airfield had a spare 37mm aircraft cannon sitting in a crate, a PT crew might borrow it, bolt it to the foredeck, and call it an improvement. If the official parts list didn't have a gasket, the motormac made one out of leather and hope. The quiet rule was simple. If it works tonight, it's doctrine tomorrow. Everything changed after December 7, 1941. In the Philippines, the Japanese push came fast. Big American ships were sunk or ordered away. Air power shifted to the enemy, but the tiny wooden boats could still move. At first, they were couriers and scouts. They ran messages across minefields and into harbors at night. They took shots at freighters, then slipped back into coves. They learned where the reefs cut like knives and where a narrow creek might hide you from aircraft at dawn. Their best-known mission in this early chaos was not a kill, but a rescue. In March 1942, a young lieutenant named John D. Bulkley led a group of PT boats on a high-risk run to pull General Douglas MacArthur, his family, and his staff out of Corregidor. Imagine that crossing. Enemy patrols in every direction, air raids at first light, big water slamming a small hull all night. The PT boats zigzagged through the islands, riding black water and luck to reach Mindanao, where aircraft could carry the party the rest of the way. It was a human story first, but it was also a message to every sailor paying attention. These small boats could go where large ships could not, and they could do it under the enemy's nose. Speed and surprise were only half the story. The other half was pain. The early torpedo gear was heavy. Tube launched fish took up precious deck space and made the boats top-heavy. Worse, as the crews already knew, the weapons could fail. A perfect shot might end in a dull clunk and no fireball. Close-in fights were bloody. A wooden hull does not shrug off splinters, it throws them like knives. One burst from a destroyer's gun could turn a PT boat's cockpit into a storm of wood and glass. Crews slept in their life jackets. They kept a knife ready to cut tangled lines and a plan to get to the beach if fuel tanks lit up. They learned to read the dark, how the shine of a reef at low tide looks different than open water, how the wind lays down chop in one place and builds it in another, how a ship's silhouette changes as it turns and shows you either a slim knife edge or a broadside full of guns. Night after night made them older than their years. Out of this pressure came change. Crews and engineers worked together to make the boats hit harder and handle better. The heavy torpedo tubes began to give way to roll-off racks, which were lighter, simpler, and safer to use in the tight quarters where PTs lived. New torpedoes with better fuses and consistent running depth raised confidence. The gun fit thickened. Twin 50s at the cockpit stayed, but boats added 20mm Oerlikons. Sometimes a 37mm forward cannon scavenged from a fighter, and later, when supply caught up with imagination, even a 40mm Bofors on the stern. These changes did not turn the boats into little destroyers. They turned them into ambush predators that could choose the right tooth for the job. Torpedo for a large ship, cannon and machine guns for barges and small craft. Even in the Philippines, the shape of the coming war was visible. The Japanese relied on speed to run troops and supplies down long chains of islands at night. Their destroyers were skilled, their navigation was sharp, and their doctrine trusted darkness. The Americans needed something agile and brave to meet them in that darkness. Big ships could not run inside reef lines without risk. Aircraft could not stay on station for hours every night. Submarines were deadly in deep water, but clumsy in shoals. The answer was obvious to the sailors who had been riding these wooden rockets for months. Before those famous nights, there were quieter lessons. The boats learned to hunt in pairs or threes. One boat would press close while another flanked to cut off the target's turn. They learned to ride the shadow of the coast to hide their white wakes, then veer out, launch, and vanish again into the surf line. They learned to listen to the weather and pick the worst of it, because bad weather was their friend. It made destroyer searchlights blind and gunners slow. They learned to set simple, brutal rules. Never fire a gun too early. Never turn toward a searchlight. Never outrun your partner. Never forget that the enemy has a say. Above all, they learned patience. A 2-minute burst of action cost 3 days of repair, refuel, and reset. And the next chance might come, only if they could keep the engines alive and the crew from going numb with fatigue. The men themselves are easy to picture if you know what the work did to them. Sunburn and salt in every crease of the skin, fuel smell in the clothes, a habit of speaking in short sentences because the engines were always loud, a superstition about lucky knives and lucky hats, an engineer who could swap a carburetor in the dark by touch, a skipper who would pour coffee into a metal cup and hold it to a hot manifold for heat, then balance it without spilling as the boat slammed through chop. They were equal parts professional and improvised. They cursed the gear that failed and loved the boat that brought them home, even with holes through the thin boards of her side. So why did these boats matter? Because the Pacific was not only a wide ocean, it was a maze of tight places. In those places you needed eyes that could see at night, hands that did not shake, and a craft that could move like a thought. The PT boats could be scattered across an island chain like tripwires. A single boat might not sink a convoy, but it could force a convoy to slow, turn, and break schedule. It could report the enemy's path in time for bigger hunters to set a trap. It could rescue a downed airman before dawn. It could run a message through a blackout that might save a battalion on the beach. A navy needs queens and rooks and bishops, but sometimes you win with a knife you keep under the table. By the time the last American PT boats were burned on the beaches in the Philippines to keep them from capture, the school was out of its infancy, the designs were maturing, and the crews had learned what they needed to know: how to survive long enough to hurt the enemy again tomorrow. The next classroom would be the Solomon Islands, a chain of jungle teeth biting up from black water. There, a nightly race began. The enemy called the Tokyo Express, destroyers sliding down the slot in darkness to bring men and supplies to hot beaches. There, narrow seas and close shores would test everything the PT boats had learned: how to dance in shallow water, how to hide in rain, how to strike from the side like a shark. There, the Mosquito Fleet would earn its name. Before we cross to that battleground, hold this picture in your mind: a map of the Solomons at night, a string of ink-black islands, the long channel between them glowing faintly under starlight. A handful of boats sits quiet under mangroves. Engines cool, men whisper. Across the water, the low thunder of fast ships grows. The coxswain checks his grip on the wheel. The skipper watches the glow come closer and remembers every lesson written in sweat from the Philippines. When he speaks, it is the same voice you heard at the start of this story. Calm, steady, never quite loud enough for fear to hitch a ride. They will go out again. They will press closer than is safe. They will fire with no promise of a hit. And still, they will go, because the only way to make a giant stumble in the dark is to tap its ankle and vanish before it falls. In our next part, we enter the Solomons and meet the Tokyo Express at full speed. We will ride along a night when a Japanese destroyer's stern tiers open before dawn. We will see how a wooden boat can win a duel it has no right to fight, and how another night ends with a PT cut in two by a steel bow. The question ahead is simple and sharp. Can speed, nerve, and a handful of torpedoes change the shape of a campaign? Stay with us. The answer waits in the dark water of Guadalcanal. The night is tight as a clenched fist. The sea is black glass. Somewhere ahead, engines throb in a steady rhythm. The sound of big ships running fast down a narrow channel. Two small boats drift with motors idling low, wakes hidden in the surf. The skippers speak in hand signals and short words. They know the channel bends left around a dark headland. They know the enemy will round that corner at speed. They know they have seconds, not minutes, to choose. Close the distance and fire, or live to regret a missed chance. Here is the question that will carry us through this hour. When a tiny wooden craft meets a steel destroyer in a knife fight at midnight, can speed, nerve, and a handful of torpedoes bend the shape of a campaign? The Solomon Islands did not care who was brave. They cared who understood the dark. The long trench of water called the Slot funneled Japanese destroyers, what sailors nicknamed the Tokyo Express, down to Guadalcanal and back again, night after night, like a train schedule with guns. The Americans had big ships, but reefs and islands made those waters a maze. Aircraft were deadly at dawn and noon, but the Express raced in hours when the sky was closed and the rain came sideways. So the job fell to the small ones, the patrol torpedo boats, the Mosquito Fleet, armed with 4 torpedoes, machine guns, and the kind of nerve that learns to breathe only between searchlight sweeps. The tactics looked simple on a chalkboard and felt brutal in a cockpit. Pick a choke point, post one section of boats close to shore where surf can mask a wake, post another farther out to catch a target's turn. Idle low until the bright ship noise grows. Use land as your cover. Cross the enemy's track at an angle, never directly head-on, because a turning destroyer can bring more guns to bear than you can survive. Fire late. Fire from closer than your stomach wants, because torpedoes love short ranges and hate long guesses. Then turn hard out, low and fast, into the dark you came from. If you do it right, the first clue the enemy gets is a white line sliding across his bow and the dull smack of a hit somewhere deep. But the enemy learns too. After a few weeks of surprises, Japanese destroyers throw searchlights that cut the water like swords. They fire star shells that float and glare, turning night to dirty day. Their gunners crowd the rails with heavy machine guns, waiting to rake any streak of wake that looks wrong. Soon, it is a duel of habits. PT skippers teach themselves to read moonrise and cloud cover like a second map. They time attacks for squalls that strip the sky and make the wind hiss. They practice the cruel art of patience, letting one ship pass to get a clean angle on the second. And always, always, they remember the first rule: never waste a shot just to be first to fire. A wasted shot is a dead friend. On a hard December night off Cape Esperance, that patience paid out in full. A Japanese destroyer, the flagship of a confident admiral, ran the familiar gauntlet along the north coast of Guadalcanal. The PTs lay in wait, small and low, watching a wall of white water build under the destroyer's bow. When the angle came right, they sprinted from the shadows and launched. Torpedoes are blind fighters. You only know they matter when the sea behind a stern lifts and a ship that should be steady begins to pull to one side like a man with a broken ankle. Fires rose on the destroyer's aft decks. Ammunition cooked and spat. The ship slowed, stumbled, and died before dawn. For one night at least, the math of the Solomons had changed. Little had cut big, and the current of the Express lost a beat. These small victories built reputation. They also built anger. Searchlights swung wider, tracers swept lower. The Express adjusted its timing and routes. Not every attack would end with a bloom of fire. Sometimes the white lines missed, or a warhead hit bad and gave a dull thud instead of a proper crack. Sometimes the ocean made the decision. The most famous of those nights began without warning. A dark shape flashed out of the black, harder and closer than anyone wanted. In the scramble of boats and wakes, a Japanese destroyer, fast, alert, and big as a cliff, ran down a PT and sliced it in two with its bow. Explosions did not follow, only silence and the slap of water on broken wood. The men in the water gathered on a tiny island, then another, nursing burns and cuts, rationing strength, writing a message on a coconut because paper was gone and the sea was patient. Local scouts and a coast watcher threaded that message through jungle and reef to a base that could answer it. When a rescue boat nosed in days later, the men looked older than their years. That story traveled far because one of those men would one day be president. But inside this campaign, it was also a lesson with sharp edges. Courage is not a shield, and luck is not a plan. A PT boat could win a night or vanish in seconds. The crews learned to live with both truths. That same survivor did not sit still after he healed. He took another boat and stripped it for a different kind of fight. Off came the torpedo tubes. On came heavier guns forward and aft. The mission changed from stalking destroyers to chopping at the enemy's fragile lifelines, barges, small craft, and river traffic that tried to hide where torpedoes were clumsy and big ships were afraid. It was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of front-page headlines. But it saved Marines pinned on a riverbank and punished the enemy where he felt safe. This was the shape of evolution in the Solomons. Not bigger, not slower, but smarter. Learn the water in front of you and build the boat you need for tonight. Through this period, the crews refined the little arts that keep people alive. The motorman learned to feather throttles so the boat could slide fast without throwing a blinding rooster tail. Gunners rehearsed silent drills, setting fuses and feed belts in the dark with hands that knew where every ridge of metal should be. Torpedomen tuned their racks and kept their gear simple because complex mechanisms fail where salt and spray live. Radio men learned to speak in short, useful bursts and hold silence like a weapon. Skippers grew into the kind of leaders who did not need volume. They held their crews together after a miss, and they held them still when patience, not heroics, would win the angle they needed. By late 1943, the fight pivoted northwest. New Guinea and New Britain offered the enemy a different kind of cloak, a coastline of mangroves and shoals. Shallow draft barges crawled the night like insects, hugging the green edge of the land where airplanes could not always see and big ships dared not go. Torpedoes were the wrong tool. They liked deep water and clean approach lines, so the PTs rearmed their teeth. A forward 37mm cannon, often an aircraft gun rehomed on a stout mount, could punch holes in a barge's flank at 200 yards. A 20mm Oerlikon could shred a deck full of cargo and men. A 40mm gun, if you were lucky enough to have one, could hammer the stern of a barge so hard it would sink from the back forward like a box filling with water. Twin 50s did their usual merciless work on anything that moved at bad angles. Some boats carried small racks of rockets to rake a shoreline and flush targets from cover. The doctrine was ugly and effective. Find the barge train, close fast, let the big gun speak first, then finish with everything else. Finding the barges was its own war. Here, a quiet revolution helped. Small surface search radar sets began to appear on PT boats, green glow screens that painted islands, shoals, and moving shapes with ghostly blips. Radar did not make the sea safe. It made it legible. In storms that would once have stopped a patrol cold, a radar-equipped PT could slide along a jagged coast and know where the land was even when eyes could not see. It could pick the barges out from a line of surf, track them as they darted for coves, and set an ambush without firing a flare that would wake every gun on the beach. Radar also let sections coordinate silently. One boat could drift dark and close. Another, farther out, could watch the whole chessboard, whispering bearings and ranges over the net, so the moment of attack felt less like a guess and more like a decision. With radar came discipline. A green screen could tempt a young skipper to believe too much. The good ones learned to tie what they saw to what they heard and smelled and felt. The pitch of surf on a reef, the curl of smoke blown low along the water, the rhythm of an engine that didn't match the wind. The best nights were the ones when everything agreed. The blip crept where a blip should creep. The wind hid your approach. The shoreline gave you a dark pocket to turn in. And the first shot landed so square, the second shot felt like mercy. The barge war demanded close work and quick exits. The enemy answered with light coastal guns hidden under jungle and sudden bursts of fire from the banks of rivers that snakes drank by day. The PTs learned to run in and out in a single breath. 2 minutes of thunder, then gone. Engines clawing water as the beach erupted behind them. Some nights ended with small rescues. Airmen hauled wet and shaking over the stern. A few soldiers crammed into the cockpit with 1,000-yard stares, a prisoner blinking at the roar of engines he had never heard up close. Other nights ended with the long, slow tow of a wounded sister boat, a pump chattering hard against a hull that slapped and leaked, the crew silent except for the motormac, muttering to himself like a man arguing with the sea. What never changed in these months was the feeling that the small things added up. A barge burned here meant a platoon's worth of supplies never reached a jungle trail tomorrow. A chase through a mangrove cut meant 2 barges beached and abandoned in panic, crews scattered, cargo lost to the tide. A night of radar-guided harassment turned a comfortable run into a dangerous one, and danger makes commanders change plans. That change, multiplied across weeks and islands, is how campaigns bend. By now, the boats themselves looked different than the sleek torpedo sprinters that first arrived in the theater. The roll-off racks had replaced the heavy tubes. Decks bristled with practical, ugly firepower that did not impress in photographs, but spoke clearly in a fight. Ammunition boxes were lashed where hands could find them without looking. The crews carried more tools than uniforms. Paint darkened to suit the water and weather. Every inch of space was earned and defended. They were gunboats now as much as torpedo boats, still fast, still wooden, still mortal, but optimized for the work the war presented each night. And yet the knife fights did not end. The Tokyo Express still ran when it could, and the PT sections still took their places where channels narrowed and currents pinched. The old dance played out again and again. Idle low, slide out, line up a track, wait for the angle, fire late, turn hard, vanish. Some nights, the sea gave them only spray and tracers. Some nights, it gave them the heavy thud that told a crew they had mattered. Each result lived side by side with its opposite. That was the life. Glory and frustration in equal measure, stolen in 2-minute slices from 7-hour patrols. What did these months teach that would matter next? 3 things, and they all point forward. First, information wins at night. A fast boat without a good picture is a bullet in the dark. A fast boat with radar, sharp ears, and disciplined crews is a scalpel. Second, weight where it counts beats elegance. A slim deck gun mounted right, with ammo close and crews drilled, is worth more than a pretty line drawing on a blueprint. Third, small craft can shape big decisions if they show up where big ships hate to go, and they do it every night. That rhythm, the relentless pressure of modest actions, turns into strategy whether anyone writes it down or not. So we end this part where the water opens again toward the Philippines. The Mosquito fleet has been tempered by reefs and storms, trained by choke points and barges, sharpened by radar screens that glow like bottled lightning. The next chapter will test those lessons in a larger furnace. There, in a long strait hemmed by islands and guns, the first contact in a vast battle will not come from battleships or cruisers. It will come from fast, wooden boats that know how to speak first in the night. Before we cross that threshold, hold this one last image, a section of PTs sitting blacked out near a narrow bend. On the horizon, a smear of light grows, the sign of engines, smoke, and steel moving fast. The coxswain's hand is steady. The skipper's voice is calm, a low thread on the intercom. Radar whispers the numbers they need. The men check safeties, touch lucky coins, and forget their fear on purpose. When the moment arrives, they will act without noise and ask for luck only after the turn is done. In the next part, we enter the gauntlet at Surigao Strait and see how these small boats help set the stage for one of the last battleship duels in history. We will face suicide boats along hidden coves, watch the sky turn dangerous with kamikaze dives, and ask our closing question. Did the Mosquito fleet merely sting, or did it quietly change how the night war was fought and won? Stay with us. The dark still has more to say. The sea is a corridor of darkness. On the chart, it's called a strait. To the men who must cross it tonight, it feels like a tunnel with teeth. Far to the south, engines rumble, heavy, confident, coming fast. A pair of small boats waits with lights out, crews quiet, fingers resting on triggers and radios. They are not here to win the battle by themselves. They are here to be first. First to see, first to speak, first to sting. Here is the question that will carry us through this final hour. Can fast wooden boats, armed with nerve and information, bend the path of a fleet large enough to shake the sea? The Philippines in late 1944 was a storm of metal and will. To force a return to the islands, the Allies needed to land armies on Leyte and keep them supplied. Japan threw in what remained of its striking power to break that landing. The result was Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, spread across hundreds of miles and fought in overlapping acts. One of those acts was Surigao Strait, a narrow south-north slot choked by islands and headlands. It was the sort of place a small boat would call home and a battleship would call a trap. The plan was simple, brutal, and old-fashioned. If the Japanese southern force tried to rush through the strait at night, they would have to run a gauntlet. At the mouth, patrol torpedo boats, dozens, spread in picket lines, each with orders to report, harass, and, if a clean angle appeared, strike. Farther up the funnel, destroyers in squadrons, stacked and ready to fire storms of torpedoes across the enemy's track. At the far, narrow end, cruisers and old battleships waiting in line, guns trained to cross the T and punish anything that made it through. For the PTs, it started with patience. You cannot crowd a narrow sea with small craft and hope to remain unseen. You must place them like invisible tripwires. Engines idled low. Men leaned on the edges of their cockpits and listened. Radar sets, the small surface search kind that painted moving dots on green glass, helped boats keep their bearings and keep a silent picture of the strait. When the first contacts appeared, they were heard before they were seen. The deep, steady thunder of big screws turning fast. Contact reports are not glamorous, but they are the bones of victory. A calm voice on a cramped radio set the table for everything that followed. Bearing, estimated range, course, speed, repeats to confirm. A second section farther along picked up the same picture and added detail. The strait began to speak, and the American commanders listened. When the small boats lunged from the dark to launch, they were not trying to duel battleships. They were trying to force reaction, to make the enemy turn, to make it dodge, to make a neat plan ugly. Torpedoes raced, searchlights snapped open like white doors, star shells floated and hissed. Tracers dragged lines across the waves. A PT lives on the edge of disaster in moments like this. The men on the throttles feathered power to stop the boat from throwing a rooster tail that would betray it. The skippers turned away from light on reflex. And still they came close enough to feel the heat of the big ship's funnels, as those ships thundered past. Some shots missed. Some shots forced sharp turns. Some shots struck home. But every shot, miss or hit, carried a price in time and order for the ships trying to bull through a narrow sea in the dark. Behind the PT lines, destroyers crouched for their own knife work. They fired spreads of torpedoes in black water, engines wound tight for the hard turnout after launch. Explosions rumbled far down the lane. The enemy formation lost shape. Ships slowed, veered, clustered where the current pinched them. And then, at the tightest part of the strait, the old battle wagons and cruisers opened their throttles and their plots and did something battleships had done since gunnery was young. They crossed the T and fired into the face of a force that could not bring all of its guns to bear. The night became thunder. When morning came, the southern thrust was broken. The first blows were not the heaviest, but they were the ones that made the heaviest possible. From that night forward, the work of the small boats multiplied. The Philippines were not just straits and headlands. They were coves and rivers and long, low beaches where anything could hide. Here a new enemy waited, explosive motorboats, piloted at high speed by men who meant to die if it drowned an American ship. Suicide boats crept from inlets like sparks blown from a fire. The PTs were asked to hunt them. Close-in gunnery is a test of nerve and drill. Against a low, fast target at night, a crew must move like a single hand. A forward cannon, 37 millimeters if you had it, barked first to break the aim and the spirit of the oncoming craft. Twin 50s stitched the water and the hull. Oerlikons hammered until the target stumbled and went under. Some nights there were many. Other nights there was only the hush after a short, savage burst, the smell of cordite, the glow of a shoreline that did not want to reveal what it had hidden. The boats policed anchorages, guarded entrance channels, and rode restless ovals around transport areas, where big ships unloaded men and machines, under a sky that grew more dangerous by the day. Overhead, a new terror made even quiet seas feel sharp. Kamikaze attacks. They fell hardest on large ships and crowded anchorages, but their presence changed every calculation. PTs became instant rescue craft, racing toward smoke to pull men from burning water, then slid back into patrol as if the change of roles were nothing at all. They carried messages when radios failed, ammunition when a beach ran dry, and orders when fog, weather, or the sheer crush of war made normal channels too slow. They were everywhere their speed could make a difference, and their size would not get them killed. In the middle of that rush came a necessary reckoning. What did these boats truly do, and what did they not do? Myth loves a clean story. A tiny craft fells a giant with a single shot and wins the night. Reality was harder and, in a way, more impressive. Torpedo hit rates were never high, especially in the early months when weapons and fuses could betray perfect aim. Big kills were rare, and newsreels tended to show the same few explosions from every angle. But the value of the Mosquito fleet sat in the margins, the parts of a campaign where numbers become outcomes. A convoy that must slow for small boat harassment arrives late. A destroyer that turns to dodge a white streak loses its place in formation. A barge line attacked 3 nights in a row will beach early and move less the 4th. Information passed 5 minutes earlier may place a destroyer squadron exactly where it must be to make a decisive shot. A fleet commander forced to worry about his ankles cannot run flat out at the goal. Psychology mattered too. After months of night fights, Japanese captains treated radar blips and wake smudges with caution. Searchlights swung wider and fired sooner. Ammunition was burned at phantoms as often as at real targets. Anxiety is not a statistic, but every turn made early and every broadside fired at darkness is a small victory for the boats that caused it. On the Allied side, the presence of fast, familiar craft near exposed beaches and narrow waters gave confidence to men who had to move when the charts were thin and the hour was bad. When someone had to go look, someone went. The cost of that presence was real. Wooden hulls do not forgive. Weather was an enemy that never ran out of ammunition. Engines drowned in their own heat. A single hit could turn a cockpit into splinters and flame. Crews carried scars, burns, shrapnel, the quiet tremor in the hands that sets in only after the boat is tied up and the adrenaline leaves. Losses were mourned without ceremony and answered the only way sailors know, by marking the map and going out again. Then the war ended, as wars do. Not with a speech for every unit, but with orders and inventories. The Mosquito fleet's fate was quick and practical. Gasoline boats with thin skins do not retire well. Many were stripped of gear and burned on remote beaches to keep them from rotting in place. A few survived into peacetime as training craft, museum pieces, or projects for people who believed that saving a wooden hull is a kind of memory work, but you cannot preserve a tempo, and tempo was the heart of these boats. What remained, what still remains, are their lessons. First, in coastal war, the first contact is often the most important. Whoever sees first, speaks first, and shapes the opponent's first reaction owns the next minute. In Surigao Strait, that minute became a plan. The plan became a broken enemy column. The broken column made room for the hammer that ended the attempt. Second, adaptability is a weapon. The torpedo sprinters of 1942 became gunboats, barge busters, and rescue craft by 1944 because crews were allowed to solve tonight's problem with tonight's tools. They scrounged, bolted, tested, and kept what worked. Third, small units, multiplied and persistent, can bend strategy. A dozen 2-minute actions, spread across weeks, will change a supply graph more surely than a single lucky hit. If you look at later wars, you can see the PT boat's DNA. Riverine patrols that slide into mangroves at dusk. Fast attack craft that can dart in and out of island chains. Special operations boats that rely on speed, surprise, and information more than armor. Radars became smaller and smarter. Engines became meaner and more reliable. Weapons became lighter for their punch. But the quiet rules, the ones that mattered in black water, did not change. Know your coastlines like family. Use weather as a cloak. Fire late and turn hard. Trust your section partner. Respect the dark. So what is the legacy? Finally, not hero worship, not a myth of tiny against huge, It is a craft of practice under pressure, a way of fighting built by people who had to learn in a hurry, who were allowed to tinker, and who kept showing up even when the record book did not promise fame. It is the memory of men who looked across a night sea and chose to close the distance anyway. Not because they loved risk, but because somebody had to be first. And the rest of the plan needed that first voice on the net saying, "Contact bearing 210, speed high, formation in column." If you have followed this story from the first engine cough in the Philippines to the green glow of radar in New Guinea and the thunder of Surigao Strait, you already understand the answer to our opening question. Yes, fast wooden boats could bend a campaign. Not by themselves, not every night, but often enough to change the rhythm of a war fought in tight water and black hours. Before we close, imagine one last patrol. The sky is clear. The strait is quiet in a way that makes you suspicious. On the horizon there is no smear of smoke, only stars and the backlight of distant lightning. The skipper checks his watch and nods once to the coxswain. The boat turns home. The crew breathes, laughs softly, and starts to strip and clean the guns the way you do when your hands want motion more than rest. Somewhere out there, another crew is doing the same. The night belongs to whoever earns it. For a long, dangerous while, the PT boats earned it. Tell us what you think the Mosquito fleet changed most: the enemy's schedule, the enemy's nerve, or our own understanding of night war. And where should we go next in this series? Across the channel at D-Day to ride with British and American coastal forces? Up the rivers with patrol boats in later wars? Or into the Cold War dawn where small craft learned new tricks for a new kind of ocean? Your choice guides our next voyage.